The very first joke by Oscar Wilde was when he was a student in his first year, and he was talking to a friend, and the lecturer, very irritated by the fact that these two people were constantly conversing, stopped and said, "Young man at the back," he pointed out Oscar Wilde. "Yes, you, sir. Can you hear what I'm saying?" And Oscar Wilde famously said, "I'm afraid we can overhear you." So some of you will be overhearing what I have to say today, which is probably excellent, unfortunate. Great. Right. Let me set the scene by just saying essentially what NATO's strategy was before the recent events, before the Wales summit, in fact, which has significantly altered the political landscape. Or rather, the political landscape was changing, which is why we had to adopt or adapt to it. Three essential points about the NATO strategy in the last 15 years. First was crisis management. So the alliance went from geographical containment of one particular country, the Soviet Union, to problem solving. Terrorism is the obvious issue here, taking part in what the Americans call the global war on terrorism, not necessarily targeting a specific terrorist movement, but targeting terrorism as a whole, moving from collective defense to collective security, moving from threat management to risk management, no longer trying to provide security for the members, but trying to manage insecurity. A very different objective. And of course the problem with risk management is that while you can argue people out of their fears, it's almost impossible to argue them out of their anxieties. They own their anxieties and they don't like giving them up. We are all very anxious in this room, but different things make us anxious. And the other problem with this idea was that there was no geographical restriction. So basically NATO went wherever people felt insecure, whether it was in the Balkans in the 1990s, fighting its first war in Kosovo, whether it was Libya, North Africa in 2011, or the Gulf of Aden with piracy in the last few years. The second pillar of NATO's strategy was partnerships, of course, Partnership for Peace, which involved almost 40 countries, links with international organizations, other international organizations like the UN, Africa Union, a kind of distributed security, no longer table d'hôte as it had been in the Cold War, but à la carte, buying in or opting in and opting out as you wished. And the key understanding was essentially that globalization was the theme of the hour, and that NATO was in the business of globalization. Wes Clark put it very well, I think, in the Kosovo War in 1999 when he was a SACEUR. He called the alliance a facilitator of globalization. Of course, the real partnership that would have counted was the elusive one with the European Union, which also claimed in its only security report in 2003 to be a facilitator of global civil society. But there, you see, was the point. The EU did civil society, NATO did globalization, and the two organizations have not managed effectively to work together. And that has been one of the failures for both of them, I would add, not just for NATO. And the third pillar of this was enlargement and Russia. Why enlargement? For the same reason that the Americans offered their non-reciprocal guarantee to Western Europe in 1949. If you look at the 16-day debate in the US Senate, the longest debate in American history about anything, which was America's signing up to the Washington Treaty in 1949 and actually joining this organization, you will find only one reference to the Soviet Union. All the references were how do we make the West Europeans confident enough in the future to ensure that they stick with democracy and they go for economic growth. And that was the argument for enlargement. How do we make the East Europeans confident enough in the future to go for democracy and to go for market capitalism? And the halfway house, halfway to the EU, which was the real objective, was NATO. We have halfway houses in Britain when we release people from usually mental asylums who go into these halfway homes where they're on a heavy medication before they are, to use the term, released into the community. So the community was the European Union, but because the East Europeans were not yet ready to join the European Union, we gave them the halfway home and the medication of NATO membership. And at the same time, of course, we had a strategic partnership with Russia, or we tried to get one, because obviously enlargement was not to Russia's good wishes. So we had the NATO-Russia Council in 2002, and before that, the Founding Act. The problem was, of course, that this was a shifting geostrategic context. So Russia was practically a failed state in the 1990s, certainly a failing society, weaker than at any time in its history in perhaps 250 years, perhaps even longer than that. And of course, after 2007, Russia was a rising state coming back into the equation. We didn't notice this until very late in the day. So if you look at when you say, is there a NATO strategy, we have to say there are three strategic concepts, one in 1991, the other in 1999, the third at Lisbon in 2010. It's only at Lisbon is there really any mention of the fact that Russia may be a problem in the future. What we see, I think, is what Robert Kaplan, the American academic, called the revenge of geography. Because in our obsession with globalization, which knows no frontiers, we had taken our eye off the fact that geography is actually more important at the end of the day, particularly when it comes to security. So this is to set the scene. These were the three strategic pillars of NATO post-Cold War, and it produced three interrelated problems. The first set of problems were NATO operations, expeditionary warfare, open-ended, no strategy. The first time that NATO got a strategy in Afghanistan was 2007. Surprising, since NATO had a presence in Afghanistan for some years before that. Didn't have a strategy before 2007. Hadn't thought it was worthwhile. We have, of course, with these expeditionary operations, whether in Kosovo or in Libya, in Afghanistan, we have uncertain and unsatisfactory outcomes. We have no political resolution. You cannot, as Tony Blair liked to say, draw a line and move on, because we haven't been able to move on from any of these expeditions because we haven't been able to draw a line. Public support has eroded. The tools that we had to accomplish these were just insufficient. I'll give you one example. When the British Army went into Helmand province in Afghanistan, which is the most dangerous province of all, we tried to secure 13 districts of Helmand. When we were replaced by the US Marines a few years ago, we were reduced to securing 3 districts of Helmand. Helmand has not been secured. It still remains as dangerous today as it was when the British first came in, perhaps even more dangerous. And we had a comprehensive approach, which was a new idea of working with civilians and NGOs, which didn't really work because NGOs don't like working with NATO and militaries have difficulties working with the NGOs. So I would say the main problem is with the NGOs, their gut reaction against working with organizations like the North Atlantic Alliance. But the problem, I think, is even greater than that, and it stems from the fact, all those caveats in Afghanistan, there are over 150 of them, I think, have been identified, what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do, why some countries took risks in Afghanistan and some refused to take any risks in Afghanistan, why the ISAF force was called a coalition of the willing, because only a few countries were actually willing to take risks, is the problem with risk management. It's highly subjective. And what puts you at risk doesn't necessarily put others at risk. And Afghanistan may have been of interest to the British and the French, but it was of very little interest to many other NATO countries who felt much more at risk from what was happening in North Africa, for example, than they did what was happening 7,000 miles away in Afghanistan. And there was no prioritization of risks, so that we continued to proliferate when it came to risk management. Every NATO strategic concept found more and more risks that we had to manage, from cyber terrorism in the last one to piracy in the Gulf of Aden. And that's all very well, but if you can't prioritize, then you're going to do everything with the same forces. And you can kid yourself that there's something called smart defense, which means you can do less for more, or you can just accept that smart defense doesn't really exist. You do less with less, which is fine, but if you're going to do less with less, you must prioritize and decide what you really want to do. And NATO could not agree on what the main risks were. The second challenge was the partnership setup, because this involved a diverse, an increasingly diverse range of countries who had different expectations of NATO, and NATO had different expectations of them. ISAF, in a sense, was a catalyst which allowed partners to work with NATO, members, countries like Japan that were not members of the North Atlantic Alliance. But ISAF, of course, has come to an end, was about to come to an end, so there is no catalyst there. And partnership failed, I think, in two key areas which were important. One, the Eastern neighborhood, and one, the Trans-Caucasus, where choices had to be made, and were not, but are now being made as we speak. Which brings me to the third problem with enlargement, that Russia never accepted, of course, NATO enlargement as anything other than a dishonest policy, which, as Gorbachev said in Berlin a couple of weeks ago, NATO cheated, essentially, by saying it wouldn't enlarge, and it did. That the Russians saw this as encirclement. Even worse, they saw this as the marginalization of Russia as a great power. And the result, I think, was almost inevitable. Putin warned us at the Verkunda conference in 2007 what would happen. We chose to ignore this for 5 or 6 years. Revisionism. That it was time to actually revise the post-Cold War settlement in Europe. Basically, we come down to two facts of life. One side claiming victory in 1991 and the other refusing to accept defeat. And if you've read your Clausewitz, you realize that you're never victorious unless the defeated country accepts its defeat. Russia never did. And secondly, of course, you have, as one writer said the other day in the New York International Times, you have a country that has all the complexes of a great power, a former great power, with the inferiority complex of being a small country. And that is a paradox that's very difficult to live with. Just to remind ourselves how small Russia is, it has less than 5% of global GDP, which is going to fall between now and 2030, whereas Europe and the European Union and the United States still have 39% of global GDP. That's the difference in power strength. You wouldn't know it, of course, because the Russians have invested so much in military power recently, and we have disinvested in military power completely. Now, the Wales summit was intended to address these three problems, and to some extent it did, but I also think it failed in addressing the bigger picture. So let's just start with the success. The Readiness Action Plan, which is, of course, going to, or is meant to, highlight the need to make the NATO response force more responsive, the pre-deployment of equipment, particularly in the Baltic states, more NATO exercises, more serious NATO exercises than steadfast jazz, for example, last year, which was embarrassing. Will this happen? It may happen. It has to happen. It needs to happen if NATO is to have a credible strategy. So that is one aspect, to deal with operations, the first of those three pillars, and to make sure that NATO is actually more operative than it would otherwise be. The second is to keep the partnerships, but this time to deal with new enemies, particularly ISIL, for example, ISIS or IS, whatever you want to call it. Let's call it ISIL. Ocean Shield is very important, the anti-piracy campaign, to keep with expeditionary warfare, to find more partners and to deepen the partnerships to make them more real. That is the aspiration. Again, whether it can be achieved or not, we will have to see. And the third is what to do with Russia. And what happened at Wales was enlargement was taken off the table. There will be no further enlargement of NATO, ever, I suspect. But anyway, not for the foreseeable future. And meanwhile, we are boosting, or trying to boost, collective defense against a resurgent Russia by boosting defense spending to 2% of GDP and making sure that 20% of defense spending is spent on procurement. Now, if all these things are realized, and it's a very big if, given the three factors, lack of political will, the fact that our economies have barely recovered from the 2008 financial crisis, and everyone is warning us that we can go back into another one almost overnight. And the third factor is, I think, disagreement as to how important these targets actually are. Everyone has signed up for them, Some countries take them seriously. Others have just signed up so as to be on side, but probably don't intend to deliver. If that is the case, we may be okay. But what I wanted to talk about for the rest of this talk is what are the real challenges? Because these are the ones that politicians deal with on an immediate day-to-day basis. But they're not the systemic challenges which explain the serious situation that we're now in. And of course, academics love systemic challenges. So I'm going to be rather academic about what I say next. And I think that the three systemic challenges are first, the fact that we have not thought strategically for a very long time and may indeed be incapable of thinking strategically. The second is that we have to recognize that globalization is a narrative whose time has come and gone, and that we have to start talking geography as everyone else in the world does, particularly China and Russia. And thirdly, that we have to be very serious about the failure of the EU and NATO to agree on what they should do. And I would argue, not because I'm English, that it's time to give up on European security and defence policy and to get absolutely real about our total dependence on the United States and find ways in which we make ourselves interesting to America for the foreseeable future. That perhaps is the most controversial thing I can say in a city like Brussels. It would not be controversial in a city like London. First, strategy and our inability to think strategically. What is strategy? Well, I like to say my students were very upset a year or two ago when they heard that Britney Spears had shaved her hair off. And her manager was asked whether she'd done this on the spur of the moment or whether she'd been thinking about this for some time. And her manager said, Britney doesn't do strategy. So that is what strategy is. You don't do things on the spur of the moment. You're not David Cameron, who makes up European Union policy for the Conservative Party as it comes to him every week. David Cameron is a politician who is incapable of strategic thinking. You do the long term, or at least the mid-term. You think about where you want to get to. Strategy has changed in the world today. It's much more difficult than it used to be. 50 years ago, it was relatively easy because it was instrumental. Instrumental rationality, you set an ends and you found the means. Today, it's what academics call reflexive, which is just a fine word for saying you have to reflect on the consequences of your own actions all the time. Because you may, in reacting incorrectly, be a greater threat to yourself than the challenge that you're actually facing. That's the problem of terrorism. As you all know, terrorists don't make history, they trigger history. They get you to overreact because they don't have sufficient power to actually change very much. You can change a lot by overreacting. And if you're the United States and you've spent up to $6 trillion since 2001 overreacting to what happened on 9/11, you can do a lot of damage to your credibility in the world, to your legitimacy, and indeed to your basic interests. So let's be frank. Strategy is more difficult than at any other time because we know that everything we do has side effects. And the side effects can be worse than what we're trying to address. But if you wish to do strategy, you have to tell yourself a story. And there are two stories, I think, that we can tell ourselves, and I'm not sure that NATO's told them. The first is the ISIL story. What is ISIL all about? ISIL is here today, gone tomorrow. Something else will take its place. I think we are facing the collapse of the Middle East system that we have taken for granted since 1920, the shorthand of which is the Sykes-Picot system, the agreement in 1916 between the British and French to divide the Middle East up between them. The collapse, I say, because you wouldn't know the extent of the collapse by reading the newspapers. Let me just give you some figures for if Britain were Syria. If Britain was Syria, the 2.5 million people living in Greater Manchester would have gone, every one of them. So would half the population of Greater London, the whole of the population of Glasgow. The refugees, and this is the greatest refugee crisis in Middle East history, have all mostly gone to the Lebanon, which has increased its population by 40%. In the last 2 years, by 40%. That's the equivalent of everyone who's actually emigrated to Britain in the last 105 years coming in 3 years. If Syria were Britain, or Britain were Syria, the unemployment rate in Britain would not be 3%, it would be 40%. The 3% is what happened as a result of the 2008 financial crisis. 40% would be the equivalent of 14 2008 crises in 4 years. If Britain were Syria, half the school children in British schools would no longer be in school. That's the extent of the Syria crisis. You would not know it from reading the newspapers, where we glide over these statistics about refugees and people going to Lebanon, etc. You cannot put Syria back together again. It's gone. It will no longer be reconstituted as a country, and it will drag down other countries. I suspect you can't put Libya back together again. There are 3 separate authorities in Libya at the moment. And there are other countries, Jordan is in the front line, that are threatened with disappearance as countries on the map. And then we come to make the situation even worse, which also partly explains the situation. We find ourselves involved in probably one of the grimmest civil wars that is about to impact us, and that is the Sunni-Shia civil war, which goes back to 1979, when you had 2 brands of pan-Islamism, one the Iranian Revolution, and the other in Afghanistan, which was a pan-Sunni form of pan-Islamism. And then, of course, you have the invasion of Iraq in 2003, which just split the communities even more and cemented the hostilities between them. And then you have the Arab Spring, which achieved nothing positive, but unfortunately negatively cracked open the entire system that we've come to rely upon, fueling the Sunni-Shia antagonisms. The failure of the Arab Spring was, I think, cemented at the weekend by the failure to prosecute Mubarak, prosecute but not find him guilty of anything. However, there is another fact we should bear in mind, and this is a third factor. We have contributed to this. We contributed to it with the Sykes-Picot Treaty. We contributed to it by the governments that we chose to support. We contributed to it by invading Iraq. And we have contributed very largely to this crisis, because we imagine that ideas like human rights and democracy have a power of their own to transform the lives of everyone. And unfortunately, they don't. And our interventions facilitate state collapse, as in Libya, and produce new types of tyranny. There was a headline in the Times 2 days ago about Afghanistan: better governance, no government. This is essentially what I think we are bringing: better governance without government. So we must be very careful how we deal with ISIL and how we deal with this particular manifestation. We must not find ourselves a party to a civil war. Basically, what I'm saying is that NATO has some responsibility, but the United States bears the most for making it up as it goes along. And I want to just give you an example of that. I was in London in 2005, when General Abizaid came into town to rebrand the global war on terror and recall it the Long War. There was a small lunch for him, which I happened to be party to. There was also a very famous British military historian present, the elder statesman in the room. And Abizaid turned to him and he said, "You know, what we don't understand is that we give these people democracy in the Middle East, and what do they do with it? They vote these awful people into power, like Hamas. Where are we going wrong?" And the military historian said, "Well, you see, General, it's one thing to promote democracy. That's the easy bit. It's just institutions and a ballot box. Promoting liberalism is a very different matter. And actually expecting that by democratizing the Middle East you'll pacify it goes against a lot of Western philosophy, from Thucydides to Machiavelli, who warn us about democracy being, if it's illiberal, aggressive, imperialist, and often dangerous to the neighbors." At which point the general turned to his aide and said, "Paul, I hope you're getting this down." In other words, we were making it up as we went along, at the cost of thousands of lives, at the cost of general instability and disaster. So when China and Russia are so critical about our bungling in the last 15 years, we should on this occasion listen to what they have to say, because our record is not very good. And that is why many of the Arab countries are very, very hesitant to get too involved in our latest global war, which General Allen tells us will take 50 years, another long war against ISIL. Do we actually know what we're doing? I just raised that question because I'm not absolutely sure we do. Second challenge I think that we have to face is that globalization is in trouble. It's in trouble both in terms of the message, and it's in trouble in terms of the medium. The message, of course, is cosmopolitanism, but that's not the language that we now hear. My students say to me these days, was Samuel Huntington right? Is this what we're facing now, a clash of civilizations? To which, of course, I doggedly say no, it's not a clash of civilizations, but it is certainly the language of civilization. And if Samuel Huntington was still alive today, he would be even more on the lecture circuit than he was a few years ago. So in Russia, we have Vladimir Putin talking about Ruski Mir, talking about Russian values based on language in the Orthodox Church that are totally incompatible with Western values. We have a Chinese president saying 3 weeks ago that Western values were, and I quote, a threat to the moral foundations of the Chinese people. He sent his children to school in the United States. He's now saying that the Chinese shouldn't send their children to school in the West because they will be corrupted by Western ideas and they will bring back the contagion, the infection of Western ideas. That's the language which is now being spoken. We have a Turkish president who insists that Muslims discovered the Americas hundreds of years before anybody else. We have an Indian president who recently said that the god Ganesh, the elephant-headed god, showed that the Indians were first in plastic surgery, historically. We also have a government that is closing down German-speaking schools in India and replacing them with Sanskrit-speaking schools, a language that is one of the great languages, but nobody really wants to speak. That's the first problem. We are seeing, I think, the idea that, in fact, values are not universal. And this, of course, runs against the whole Western message of the last 30 or 40 years, for good or ill. And then we're seeing, of course, the medium. The medium is the market. Now, what do you do if you're dealing with a country like Russia, which, according to Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, is, and I quote, a minority stakeholder in globalization? And I think he's absolutely right to some extent. Russia is a minority stakeholder in globalization. It doesn't speak the language. It speaks the language of a Eurasia Union. But we also speak the language of Eastern neighborhoods. And it was the contest between these two regional objectives and ambitions which possibly precipitated the Ukraine crisis. And meanwhile, we have the United States intent on building a trans-Pacific community without China and intent on building a transatlantic partnership without Russia. So I would suggest to you that globalization has probably hit the buffers, as it did in the 1930s, as it did in 1914. A pause, perhaps, before the next round. But we know from the historical record that these pauses happen and they can last for some time. I think we're at one of them. And then, of course, we have the possibility of a new Cold War. I just come from a meeting with some Russians who are close to Putin, who say we're already in a new Cold War, and what we have to do is get the rules we had in the old Cold War, because it's dangerous to have a Cold War without rules, without mutual assured destruction, essentially, without détente, without summit meetings. They have a point. So we might want to talk about that. The third, I think, major point is we have to deal with the perceived decline of the United States. Whether it's relative or whether it is terminal, I happen to think that it is relative, and it's certainly not terminal. But there's no doubt at all that the sharks are circling the waters. They can smell the blood. They know the United States is wounded in the water, just as they knew that Britain in 1900 was wounded in the water and could no longer enforce what Robert Gates, the former Defence Secretary, called the rules of the road. But there is, of course, no other country in the world that can enforce the rules of the road. So whether we like it or not, we are stuck with the United States. Why is the United States perceived to be weak? It's perceived to be weak for many reasons. One is the Obama administration itself and the president. Another is the philosophy of the Obama administration, leading from behind. Hillary Clinton's critique of the administration, which she served so loyally for 4 years in her memoirs, that Obama's motto, "Don't do stupid stuff," is fine, but it's not a strategy. I would agree with that. And also, of course, I think the fact that the United States, even the pivot to Asia, is actually not very much when you really look at the nuts and bolts of it. So even when the US wants to repivot, it's not the story it was before. So what is the big story here? I want to kind of conclude on this. And it's a rather disturbing note. And people will tell you that they have not known a more dangerous period in international relations. One must always be careful when people tell you that, particularly people of my age. I've reached the age now where I'm nostalgic for the past and look back fondly to a past that never existed. But what I do think is something I've been saying for 10 years or longer, that the international order that we take for granted is now under challenge. What's challenged is its resilience. Resilience means many things, but engineers, when they talk about whether structures are resilient, and political scientists, when they talk about orders being resilient, mean whether they're still fit for purpose, whether they can still address the challenges and threats and risks that we face. Now, what the Wales summit made clear is that NATO is committed to underpinning this order, insofar it has the power to do so. So there were references to continuing to meet non-traditional challenges, everything from cyber terrorism by non-state actors to global climate change. It's still committed to working with development agencies in the world and the United Nations. It is very much committed, and it wants to take further public-private partnerships, to extend those, which I think you have to, particularly in cyberspace. It wants to continue the ISAF model of cooperation for different threats, like ISIL, and it wants to, as it said, address the world in its public relations, not just the membership audience of NATO. But what is this international order that it wants to prop up? Is it some kind of Anglo-American project going back to 1815, which is no longer very relevant in a post-American world? Is it devoid of any coherent vision of itself? Is it in trouble because of what we call American exemptionalism, not exceptionalism, exemptionalism, being always exempt from the rules that you yourself are trying to promote? What is this international order? I think this is the big question, and it leaves me with these two questions. Is NATO committed to shoring up a failing project? Because that project is under challenge from Russia and will soon be under challenge from China. Or is it interested in containing the dangers that we face long enough for particularly China and the United States? I think there's little prospect to Russia here, of China and the United States agreeing on how to reform the present international order. The Chinese have a motto for their relations with the United States, which I suggested to the Russians they should adopt, because it's a very realistic one: neither friend nor foe. Never a friend in the foreseeable future, because the value system of the two societies are so different, but conflict to be avoided, if at all possible, at all costs, and working together to try to make this international order, which is deeply unfair and invidious to many, a little more fairer and a little more representative of the change in the balance of power than it is at the moment. Russia, I think, has nothing to contribute to this debate under its present leadership. I hope that China will help. And meanwhile, what should NATO do? Deal with the problems to buy time for that debate to take place, because it has hardly begun. And on that note, I will end.